Okay, so that's going to tell us what happens in a competitive labor market. But as we talked about before spring break, we're going to get very different predictions when we think about a less competitive labor market. In other words, a labor market where firms have some amount of market power. To think about this, let's lay out a graph that shows us the choices available to a firm with market power. Now, what it means that a firm has market power is that rather than facing a perfectly elastic, completely flat labor supply curve, right, for the firm itself is going to have an upward sloping labor supply curve, right? A labor supply curve that looks like this. And I'm actually going to write this from the perspective of the firm as an inverse labor supply curve. So I'm going to write W of L. And the reason is essentially what this is going to mean is this is the wage rate that a firm would have to offer in order to hire L workers. And just like any other firm, we also have a marginal revenue product curve, MRP. And we're going to have a marginal revenue product that is decreasing as we increase the number of workers, right? In other words, we have diminishing marginal returns to labor. Now, the important thing here for understanding the effect of a minimum wage is that a monopsonistic firm like this, in other words, a firm that has some market power, is not going to choose to hire workers until wage equals marginal revenue product. The reason for that, as we talked about before the break, is that at this wage, right, where wage equals marginal revenue product, this very last worker that we hire isn't bringing in any more revenue for the firm than they're costing in wages, right? In other words, the profit we're getting from that last worker is zero. Now, that would be okay, except that in order to hire that worker, we had to give a raise to every other worker, right? In other words, if instead of hiring there, we'd hired somewhere a little bit lower, like this, we would have saved ourselves this big wage bill, right? This raise that we would have to give to every single worker. So this last worker here didn't just cost us their own wage, they also cost us this raise that we had to give to every other worker in order to hire them. So in order to think about that, right, we can think about the total extra cost that we incur by hiring an extra worker as the marginal expense of labor, right, the MEL of L. And that's going to equal the change with respect to L in our total wage bill, right? So L times W of L. Now, just using the chain rule, right, we'll have DL times W of L is W of L, right, plus L times DW LDL. And what this means, right, this is going to have exactly the same interpretation as what we just laid out here. What we're going to say is that in order to hire a new worker, you have to incur two different costs. The first cost, the most straightforward cost, is you have to pay that extra worker. That's W of L. The second cost, right, the slightly less straightforward cost, is that in order to hire that worker, you have to give all the other workers, L, a raise equal to DW LDL. Right? In other words, this is the amount that your wage rate has to change to hire that extra worker. And so as a result, the marginal expense of labor, the real cost of an extra worker, is going to be higher than the wage rate. And the difference between the two is going to grow. And so when a firm is deciding how many workers to hire, they're going to hire up until the point that the marginal expense of labor is equal to their marginal revenue product. Right, this is going to be their L star. They're not going to pay them, right, a wage equal to their marginal revenue product. They're going to pay them the lowest wage that they can get away with, right? The lowest wage at which they can hire L star workers. That's going to be W star. And there's a very important thing that I want to point out here that's going to be really important when we think about the effect of a minimum wage in this model. And that is that our L star here is really equal to the amount of labor supplied at W star. Right? If we think about what's stopping the firm from hiring more workers, it's not that the firm doesn't want more workers at a wage of W star. They're not willing to give everyone a raise to hire more workers, but they would actually like to hire all the way here at LD, right? All the way up to where W star equals marginal revenue product. The thing that's stopping them from having more workers, the thing that's limiting the amount of employment, is that only L star workers are willing to work at a wage of W star. Does that make sense? So firms that are that have market power, monopsonistic firms, always have labor shortages, right? They're saying, gosh, I wish I could hire more workers, but I can't. Now, as a result of that, when we think about what happens when we impose a minimum wage on this firm, we're going to have the same thing happen that happened in the competitive labor market. When we impose a minimum wage, we're going to have fewer workers demanded and more workers supplied than we had at this old wage W star, right? Because labor supply curves are upward sloping and our marginal revenue product, which is kind of like a labor demand curve, is downward sloping. However, because of the fact that before we had a minimum wage, there were more workers demanded than workers supplied, we can end up having a higher level of employment when we have an increase in labor supply and a decrease in labor demand. This will be true in this case, right, where we're still limited by labor supply at this new minimum wage. It would also be true if we set a higher minimum wage like this. Right, in that case, we would be limited by labor demand, right? We would end up hiring up until the minimum wage equals marginal revenue product, because that would happen before we ran out of workers willing to work. And it would also happen if we set a really high minimum wage like this, right? Now, when are we going to end up with a minimum wage increasing employment, and when are we going to end up with a minimum wage decreasing employment? Well, ultimately, it's going to be about whether the marginal revenue product, right, the point where wage equals marginal revenue product, happens before or after our old limit of labor supply, right? So this first minimum wage is going to increase employment because we've increased labor supply, and that's still the limiting factor. The second minimum wage is also going to increase employment. The limiting factor becomes labor demanded, right, is where wage equals marginal revenue product, but that happens at a higher level of employment than our labor supply before the minimum wage. This third minimum wage is going to reduce employment because the marginal revenue product equals that wage at a level of employment below our original L star, right, below the labor supplied at our original minimum wage. And so, in contrast to the competitive model, where we got an unambiguous prediction that doesn't depend on the amount of the minimum wage, that an increase in minimum wage has to decrease employment, here we're going to find out that an increase in minimum wage is going to increase employment if the increase is small. So a small minimum wage increases employment. And a large minimum wage will decrease employment. And what we can say is minimum wage is large if the marginal revenue product equals the new minimum wage at a level of employment that is less than the labor supply at our original equilibrium wage. Now, when that's going to happen, how big of a minimum wage is going to be big and how big of a minimum wage is going to be small is going to depend on just how much market power a firm has. In other words, the more steeply upward sloping the labor supply to a firm is, the bigger the difference is going to be between the profit maximizing wage and the marginal revenue product, and the higher the minimum wage can be before it starts to decrease employment relative to what we had before the minimum wage at all. And as you're going to show in your problem sets, it actually only depends on the slope of our labor supply to the firm. This point does not depend at all on the slope of the marginal revenue product curve. And that's a pretty cool result that I think you're excited to show for yourselves.